Thank you, Sylvia. And I want to thank Dick as well. Sylvia and Dick have done a lot for interfaith relations and for all of us. And my many years of friendship with them have been incredibly meaningful. Doug, it's been fantastic having this time together. And Kyle, thank you. And thank all of you, especially those of you who have been here twice. That's far beyond any call of duty. And I'm really grateful again that you would dedicate the heartbeats to this topic. So my question today is, does anti-Judaism's past tell us anything about its future? And I think you're probably looking at me saying, what a stupid question. But it's one I've been thinking about for a long time. And it feels different every day. I mean, my thinking about it feels different every day as new events unfold our present towards our future. And of course, I was reminded of the past every day that I was spending in Berlin until I came here in February. Because of course, that landscape is littered with monuments to the victims of a relatively recent and massive example of the murderous capacities of what I call anti-Judaism. So why do I ask this question? Relationship between past and present. Does the past have anything to tell us about the present? The question could seem silly in that it might seem obvious that past anti-Judaisms have something to do with the future, even if that something isn't eternal repetition like the Jewish liturgy sometimes claims. But in fact, many people, and I have to say this because you might not believe me, many people have imagined that attitudes towards Jews in their own time and place have nothing to do with previous attitudes towards Jews. So today, for example, there are plenty of people who argue that anti-Jewish sentiment is present today, not due to any history of anti-Semitism, but entirely to the present day actions of the state of Israel. For the most extreme of those critics, attention to past anti-Semitisms is not only irrelevant to the present, it's a ruse or an excuse to distract us from the crimes of Israel in the here and now. So, and I'm not taking away from that position. That's a powerful intellectual position that is very dominant in many circles today. So what is the relationship between anti-Zionism and the present? I just described anti-Zionism, right? What's the relationship between anti-Zionism in the present and anti-Semitism in the past? Right there, you have a really difficult question. And this is an important and pressing question. And one of the reasons it's so difficult, I mean, it's important and pressing because if anti-Zionism is related to past anti-Semitism, we would want to know, right? And if it isn't, we would also want to know. But it's very difficult to know because we don't have the benefit of hindsight. We're living in the present and we can't see the future to determine whether things being said today will turn out to be conclusively anti-Semitic or not. So what I want to do to just pose the problem for you, because I think by now I've got heads spinning, is I want to focus on a different time and place, one we all know a little bit about, in which many very, very intelligent people were convinced that there was no relationship between the anti-Jewish ideas of their own time and the anti-Jewish ideas of the past. And if we look at that example, maybe it helps us recognize our own position today. So this person is a philosopher called Hannah Arendt. She's always shown smoking cigarettes. I don't know if even in the movies that have been made about her, when they want to show her thinking, they show her smoking cigarettes. That's how they imagine that a philosopher thinks. She was very consumed by the question, how and why do ideas about Jews and Judaism become convincing explanations for the state of the world in a given time and place? So today, there are plenty of people who turn to ideas about Jews and Judaism, Israel and Zionism to explain the state of the world. She was interested in a different period, the 1930s. She lived in Germany, she fled Germany for France, and she fled France for the US, and she took up these questions. And she said, you know, anti-Semitism doesn't help me think about that. Anti-Semitism as a concept doesn't help me think about why people in the present become convinced that Jews are the explanation for what's wrong with their time and place. Why not? Because according to her, anti-Semitism is irrational. It's like saying there's really no reason for that enmity. The enmity is irrational. And she told a joke to make the point, a joke that was common in early 20th century Europe, which was about the Jews and the bicycle riders. I just gave away the punchline, but it's basically two guys on a boat, an anti-Semite and a non-anti-Semite. And the anti-Semite is saying, you know, it's the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. And the non-anti-Semite finally says, yeah, you're right, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews and the bicycle riders. And the first guy says, well, the Jews, of course, but why the bicycle riders? And the second guy says, well, why the Jews? So the joke was meant to say, there's no reason. And she says, ideologies that move people must have a reason. Millions of people are not moved to act, in this case, to exterminate the Jews, without ideologies that feel convincing to them. And irrational is not a sufficient explanation. So here's a question: why do ideologies make cultural sense? Right? Her inquiry into the origins of totalitarianism, which is one of the more famous philosophy books of the 20th century, specifically rejected looking at history, looking at the past for an explanation of why ideologies make cultural sense. She said, looking to the past attitudes about Jews to explain attitudes in Germany and Europe today is an approach she called eternal anti-Semitism. We shouldn't look at history. We should look at what she called reality in our present. So to what reality did she turn? She turned to the reality of economic and class struggle. And she explained why people were moved to find the Jews a convincing enemy based on the fact, as she called it a fact, an economic fact, that Jews were members of the bourgeoisie, not of the working class, that they participated in the growing industrial inequality of the Industrial Revolution. They didn't identify with the worker, and that therefore they were co-responsible, I think was her phrase, co-responsible for the anti-Semitism projected against them. So notice the parallel with the present. In the present, it's colonialist reality, not any history of prejudice that animates animus towards Jews today. And meaning it's Zionism that animates animus towards Jews. And for Arendt, it was economic reality that animated animus towards Jews. That's a tough phrase to say quickly. Now, I think Hannah Arendt is a good starting point for our inquiry because she was an immensely intelligent and subtle observer living through a crescendo of what today we recognize as one of history's most massive spasms of anti-Semitism, massive and murderous. Yet during that disaster, and even more surprisingly after that disaster, after the Holocaust, in the 1950s, she insisted that the past has few answers to offer when it comes to anti-Semitism, and that we should look instead to the realities of the present, particularly in her case, the struggle between capital and labor. So in this sense, she kind of reminds me of those many intellectuals today who claim that the past has little to offer us as students of anti-Semitism, and that we should better focus our energies on present realities, such as the economically relatively privileged position of Jews in the world, which is true, and the colonial activities of Israel. So I express my own view at enormous length in this book, and I won't repeat it, but my view obviously was that history matters, because humans only make sense of the present and of the real through concepts, habits of thought, prejudices, in the meaning of that word prejudgment, prejudice, that they have themselves been shaped by the past. And those habits that shape our perception of the world and what explanations of that world we find convincing. In other words, what we think the reality of our world is not independent of the history of how we've learned to think about the world. I mean, the point may seem obvious, but it's also very complicated and easy to forget. And for many Western societies, and here we get to the meat of things, by Western, I mean Christian and Islamic cultures and their secular descendants. An important part of thinking about the world and of thinking about how to improve the world has included imagining the overcoming of Judaism, which I call anti-Judaism. So for example, to speak only of the anti-Jewish potentials of our critical approaches to economic reality, think of a thinker who influenced Arendt and just about everyone else, namely Karl Marx, and how he saw the relationship of Judaism as a religion to the economic reality he was struggling against: capitalism, the use of money, private property, etc. And he links the two. And he even argues that when Christians use money or have private property, they become Jews because they participate in the religion of the Jews. He says, when a society has private property, the Christians produce Judaism from their own intestines. Nice phrase, but it gives you an example of what I mean. So why is it that thinking about Jews and Judaism has so deeply influenced how a large part of humanity thinks about reality? And the short answer to that question has to do with the importance of two great world religions in shaping all of our ideals, shaping how we've come to think about the pursuit of the good, thinking of how we've come to think about what's evil in the world. And I mean, of course, Christianity and Islam. Before they became world religions, both those faiths, and I'll focus today on Christianity, had to explain how they were related to, but different from, better than the Jewish communities whose traditions, these are Israelite prophetic tradition, they wanted to appropriate and use as the basis for their own faiths. And they were competing with many other groups. They were competing with all of whom claimed to be true followers of the temple of God. They were competing with groups like the temple authorities, early synagogal Judaism, the Qumran community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, the best image I can give you of that sectarian world is from Life of Brian and the competitive groups that are preaching around the temple. In order to do this, in order to claim that their interpretation was the true one, the early adherents of these faiths, and when I say these faiths, I'm always going to mean both Islam and Christianity, but I'll give you mostly examples from Christianity here, and if we want to talk about Islam later, we can. But these faiths had to think constantly about the relationship to the earlier prophetic texts that we call the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament, and to the Jews who claim to be the legitimate guardians of those texts. You can see that thinking going on already in the earliest Christian traditions. One of my favorite stories is the story of, well, I don't want to give away the punchline, the two sad apostles on the road, the sad disciples on the road to Emmaus. Emmaus is Abu Ghosh outside of Jerusalem, said to have the best hummus in Palestine, Israel. And they're very sad. And a third figure arrives and says to them, "Why are you so sad?" And they say, "Well, don't you know? Have you heard that the Jesus of Nazareth, the man we thought that was the Messiah, has been crucified, and so our hopes have been dashed." And the third figure says to them, "Oh, you fools of little faith, do you not know?" And he explains to them, all the passages of Scripture which foretold his coming, his crucifixion, and his messiahship. So the first task of the risen Jesus, because of course a stranger is the risen Jesus, is to re-explain the previous tradition in a way that legitimates his claim to messiahship. That's the first, we might say the first task of the risen Jesus is to reinterpret history. That's why I think historians and prophets are actually very close to each other. But you can tell that as a historian, I'm always going to want to claim more power for my discipline. So this task of claiming a tradition, of developing new ways of reading it, of making sense, new sense of old texts, that task is what produces figures of Judaism that are sometimes anti-Jewish, because sometimes they proceed by projecting negative attributes onto figures of Judaism. So here I offer you one famous figure of Judaism, or the Pharisee. And here they're presented, and they often are in the Gospels, as hypocrites, whitewashed tombs that look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of bones of the dead and everything unclean, right? On the outside, you look righteous. On the inside, you are full of hypocrisy. And I think such passages are actually really important because they encode an entire ontology, an entire philosophy of the difference between seeming and being. We all live in a world in which things can seem one way and be quite different. This is a problem that we humans are very attuned to. And here the Pharisee figure of Judaism becomes the vessel, the image that holds that danger that things might not be what they seem. All that glitters is not gold. That's the Hobbit, but still. That danger is encoded in the figure of the Pharisee, with the Pharisee standing for what looks good but is false. It's okay to look bad but be good inside, but the Pharisee stands for outer beauty, inner death. Now, but I do want to say, I don't think we can know very much about what the Pharisees really thought by their representation in the Gospels. The Gospels are not trying to tell us what the Pharisees thought of themselves. The Gospels are a version of their rivals. But in any event, that's maybe beside the point. What I really want to stress is that every word, every representation in these debates has a long future. So if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary under Pharisee, one of the definitions you'll find, of course, is hypocrite. And that was a standard definition in many, many European languages until the 20th century, until after World War II, when it became a little unfashionable, but it's still available. Here you see some phrases from Paul's epistle to the Romans, and then I give you, just as an example of the afterlife of such phrases, the standard image of synagoga, here from one of my favorite churches, medieval churches in Burgos in Spain. And you can see how the image of synagoga is an actualization of the vocabulary that Paul has used to describe the state of Judaism after the coming of Jesus. We could just expand lots of examples of this. So the fact that Augustine, for example, called the Jews slaves to the letter, servants of the Christian, because they stand for in their wrongness, they stand for the truth of Christ, led medieval kings to create a juridical status, a legal status for Jews of slave, servus of the king. So every word in Scripture has political, social implications in the future. That's a past mattering for the future. And of course, there's even the capacity to imagine the Jews as a different genus of human than the Gentile and the Christian. Here's a passage that I talked a lot about at midday or in the earlier lecture, but I think is still relevant. So for early Christians, Judaism, and this is my general point, and Judaizing came to mean a mistaken way of relating to the world, to God, and to Scripture. A basic confusion of priorities between the material and the spiritual, the real and the ideal, became a basic concept with which to criticize and make sense of the world. And I'm going to give you an example that might seem a little strange. This is Paul speaking to Peter. And it's quite extraordinary. Many later Christians said, John Chrysostom, for example, commented on how extraordinary it is to have one apostle call another apostle a hypocrite. Because I don't have it here, but one of the things Paul says to Peter is, oh, you hypocrite, how can you, though you are a Jew, live like a Gentile, right? So we've already talked a little bit about the meaning of the word hypocrite. It's a strong word. So look at this word Judaize. Judaizare, Judaizsein in Latin and Greek. It's a very strange word because here, Paul is not talking about Jews. Paul is talking about Gentile followers of Jesus. And he's saying that when Gentile followers of Jesus do certain things, they become Jews, they Judaize. But does Judaize mean become a full Jew? What does it mean? But it means that the Christian can become a Jew. How does the Christian become a Jew? The Christian becomes a Jew when the Christian does something that is Jewish in this system of values that I've been trying to describe. So for example, if the Christian reads too literally, or if the Christian is too attached to the things of this world, like money, or if the Christian is too legalistic, right? Too attached to the laws of this world. All of these things, or if the Christian is too attached to the flesh, circumcision, or dietary laws, or whatever all of these things can make the Christian Jewish. That power of that concept means that anti-Judaism now is not just about Jews. It's a way of criticizing ourselves. It's a way of criticizing our Christian society. It becomes a very powerful way so that every Christian group that wants to compete with a different Christian group often does so by calling them Jews. It's not an accident, for example, that Luther attacked the Catholic Church as a synagogue of Satan and showed the Pope sitting like a Jew on a pig, eating the pig's feces, which was a medieval way of showing the Jews, and constantly talked about Catholics as Jews. And similarly, Catholics attacked Luther and Calvin and many Protestants as Judaizers, reading scripture too literally, etc. One way of summing it up is just in 3 lines from a poem written by one of my favorite English poets, the Protestant George Herbert, still living in an England that has no Jews, hasn't had Jews for 300 years. He doesn't know any Jews. But when he wants to think about how the Christian, he as a Protestant, should criticize himself, he writes a poem called Self-Condemnation. Great title. And he says, this is 1633. He says, "He that doth love and love amiss this world's delights before true Christian joy hath made a Jewish choice and is a Judas Jew." In other words, just loving the world too much, just loving any aspect of our material existence too much, it doesn't just make you a Jewish choice, it makes you a Judas Jew. It's the power of criticizing any and every Christian's behavior in this world that made anti-Judaism a key concept in Western thought. I might almost say that Paul's Galatians put a little Jewish Jiminy Cricket on the shoulder of every Christian and made every Christian's conscience capable of producing the charge of Judaism. But maybe that's too fanciful. My main point here is that Christianity used this concept of Judaizing, of Jewishness, to make sense of its constantly evolving world, ancient, medieval, and modern, and to make sense of the challenges that arose in that world. It also made Christians thinking about Judaism capable of generating its own object, that is, creating Judaism, the Judaism of what it targeted. And I want to give you an example, just one example, again, of a person who lived in a world where there were no real Jews, but who created one of the most famous Jews in history. And the example, of course, is Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. When Shakespeare writes The Merchant of Venice in the late 16th century, there haven't been Jews in England for 200 years. He's not putting a Jew at the center of his play because he knows real Jews and he knows this is the way they are. You know, the Jew Shylock is the main character in The Merchant of Venice. He's putting Jews at the center of his play because he wants to think about many of the issues confronting his world. What are some of those issues? Some of those issues are the rise of commerce and the mercantile class. You've all heard of the great English merchants who in the end settled North America. This is a new merchant class that is rising to power in his day. Money lending. Money lending became legal in England by Christians, well, there were only Christians in England, in Shakespeare's day. Before that, lending money at interest was a crime for which Shakespeare's father went to jail twice. But all of a sudden, money lending at interest is now legal. And Christians are lending money at interest, a practice that had always been associated with Judaism, even though there were no Jews in England, but it was a Jewish crime. Well, what's the difference between a Christian moneylender and that bad thing that we had always been told we couldn't do, the Jewish money lending? Changes in law. Shakespeare is trying to make sense of the fact that all of a sudden, the law of bonds, the law of contract changes, and where you had before been able to enter into a contract with any penalty, like let's say I entered into a contract with Doug that if I give a bad lecture, he can enslave me for the rest of my life or indentured servant me for the rest of my life. First, I'm screwed. And second, that was legal before a new practice called the chancing of bonds, which said, no. You can only enter into commensurate contracts. You can't enter into vastly asymmetrical contracts. So you can't ask a person for a pound of flesh in exchange for 300 ducats, right? That's the frame story of The Merchant of Venice. All of these are big legal, commercial, monetary, even the invention of theater. The first theater ticket for money was sold in Shakespeare's career. There was no cash, there was no theater, no pretense for cash before Shakespeare's day. How do you justify in a Christian society men dressing as women, all kinds of fake and pretend that is often not even moral? We know how many Christians thought about this because when the plague came to England, the first thing they did was shut down the theaters because they thought the theater had provoked God's anger. How do you justify all of these things? And Shakespeare sets out to do it by creating a Jewish figure and then having Christians circulate around that Jewish figure to establish what he calls the difference in our spirits. Remember, the most famous line in the play is, which is the merchant here and which the Jew? That's the basic question. How does a society figure out how to be Christian? And it's inventing a figure of Judaism to do that, in this case, Shylock. Now, I'm not saying that these invented figures of Judaism don't turn out to be incredibly powerful and incredibly important. They do. Shylock becomes, for many, many people in England, a symbol of what Jews really are, even though he's the product of the imagination of a gifted writer living in a land with no Jews. So when England is debating the Jews bill in the 18th century, whether Jews can have political rights in England, the opponents of the Jews bill say, how can you give Jews political rights? Look at what they're like. And Exhibit A in their case against is Shylock. Again, not a real Jew. So what I'm trying to say is that on the one hand, anti-Judaism as a way of Christian thinking makes anti-Judaism a very powerful source of ideals, of values, of philosophies, of ways of criticizing our world. And on the other hand, it also intersects with real Jews. When real Jews appear in a society, anti-Judaism can get to work on them. And that's what happened in modernity. When you should remember that between roughly 1492 for sure, with the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, and the late 18th century, there are no Jews from the Straits of Gibraltar to the borders of Poland, in all of Europe, with a tiny exception of some small populations in Frankfurt, a few populations in Rome. The rest of Europe is free of Jews. And yet you have all of this European space thinking with anti-Judaism to make sense of its ideals. And then all of a sudden you get a migration of all of these Jews from Russia, from Poland, from the East into this European space, and anti-Judaism starts to think with real Jews, and then what you get is anti-Semitism. Then you get the creation of systems of thought that place on these real live individuals before them all of those responsibilities of being the evil that needs to be overcome. And what I want to say is that only by taking seriously the history of these ideas, of that past, that we can begin to understand how and why so much of the world, Christian, Islamic, and secular, has spent and continues to spend so much time thinking about and thinking with Judaism. And this is true even of those groups who we think are most focused on real Jews, such as the Nazis. Few words about the Nazis. They were perhaps the most relentless and successful impresarios of anti-Judaism, in that they presented their attack on the Jewish race as the emancipation of the world from Jewish thought. I don't know if you remember Goebbels' famous speech at the burning of un-German books, right in front of Humboldt University today, right by the Staatsoper. I don't know how well you know Berlin. And he said, as he burned all of these books, the age of rampant Jewish intellectualism is at an end. We tend to forget that there were only about 500,000 Jews living in Germany at the time. So that's 0.75% of a population of 67 million. Attacking real Jews was useful to the Nazis because Europeans had so long ago learned to criticize so many aspects of themselves and their culture in terms of Judaism. That's true of economic systems. So for the Nazis, liberal capitalism was Jewish. America was the most Jewish of all places. For the Nazis, Marxist and Leninist communism was Jewish, right? But it's true of just about every other aspect of culture. Art, they held the biggest blockbuster exhibition of modern times of art until the 21st century was the Degenerate Art Exhibition, in which the Nazis condemned 112 artists as degenerate and Jewish and did an exhibition of their work. Good publicity, I guess, to be condemned as degenerate and Jewish. But a point to make is that of those 112 artists condemned as Jewish, only 5 were Jewish even by the Nazi definitions of race. The rest were Jewish by this extension that I've been trying to explain of Jewishness to styles of art, styles of mathematics. The Nazis founded a mathematics journal to purify German mathematics from Jewish types of mathematics, etc. So the Nazis succeeded in making much of Europe think that the Jews were a real and present danger to their world and way of life. But the Nazis' success in mobilizing much of Europe to attempt to murderously purge itself from the Judaism that it felt afflicted it can only be understood within the kind of history I've been trying to describe, a history that encoded the thread of Judaism into some of the most basic concepts of Christian and post-Christian thought, even the concepts that Hannah Arendt was using to try and make sense of her own situation. So they succeeded in making millions of Europeans think that in attacking Judaism, they were confronting the real ills of their society, rather than acting in the grips of a prejudice with a long history. So what about today? We also live in an age with Jewish questions. That's the title of Marx's treatise on the Jewish question. We also live in an age with Jewish questions, an age in which many millions, maybe billions of people are exposed daily to some variant of the argument that the challenges of the world we live in are best explained in terms of Israel. I don't mean the state of Israel. I mean Israel meaning Jews and Judaism. Israelite means Jewish in many languages. It's only in English that Israel and Israelite are so easy to distinguish because we don't say Israelite for Jew, but in France you do, for example. And many of these billions live in regions without real Jews, including large parts of the Muslim world that have no real Jews. And in saying this, I'm not suggesting that an inhabitant of the occupied Palestinian territories is not right in understanding their situation, the most vital components of their situation in terms of Zionism and real Jews. I'm asking, though, if when we move to the suburbs of Paris and see a fourth generation Muslim in Paris making sense of their situation, their marginalization, their poverty, and their feelings of frustration in terms of Israel, is that reality? Or if we move out to Tehran or to even for other places where no Jews have lived for quite some time, and we see entire societies understanding their most vital dangers in terms of Judaism, is that reality? Or are we also thinking in the grips of prejudice? In Europe, too, we can think of Jewless regions today that spend a huge amount of time imagining the dangers they confront in terms of Judaism. So I already used this slide in my earlier lecture, but here you have Hungary's prime minister, who was just reelected, Viktor Orban, and we all know how he deploys George Soros as a figure of Jewish capital seeking to destroy Hungary and its Christian white majority by flooding it with Muslim refugees. No Jews in Hungary. There are some Jews in Hungary, but tiny, tiny number. In fact, such thinking with Judaism is doubtless contributing to the conditions that have turned every Jewish institution in Europe in which Jews do live into a target and an armed camp. In fact, while I was in Berlin, I walked every day by a nursery school that had enough infantry in front of it to, because every Jewish institution needs to be guarded. That is itself creating a dramatic depopulation of Europe's Jews today. So of course, we know that what would cause that first big bump down, but you can see that in percentage terms, the diminution of the Jewish population of Europe since World War II is just as large or larger than that caused by the Holocaust. Similar thinking with Jews is going on here in the US. I offered you this, I'm going to call it a striking image because I can't resist a pun, because it brings together a few themes. It invokes the medieval European past. It invokes Judaism as a figure to be overcome by Christian identity. And it invokes our current politics. And it even invokes Goebbels. The age of the Jew is over is an allusion to the age of rampant Jewish intellectualism is over. So to give you an idea of how systematic these arguments can be, I offer you Kevin Mcdonald's Culture of Critique. He's often been called the philosopher of the alt-right. For him, the Jews seek to destroy the world by introducing psychoanalysis, civil rights, Marxism, immigration, homosexuality, deconstruction. But insofar as he presents the history, as he presents this history as a war between all that is good and noble in the world on the one hand, and the Jews and their followers on the other, he's not very different from similar thinkers on the left, for whom the Jews represent colonialism, unfettered capitalism, neoliberalism, privilege, inequality, and injustice. And all of these arguments could be found in earlier writings, such as, from 1944, a charmingly titled book called When? A prophetical novel of the very near future, which singled out evolution, higher criticism, modernism, communism, and all other such theories, and said that they were all the products of Jews trying to destroy Anglo-Christian society. So perhaps I'm being too dramatic in describing this thinking with Judaism that's going on today as a war. I don't know how literally I should take this article, which came out with the publication of my book, Anti-Judaism, or the young white man who stood up a couple of years ago at a talk I gave in Connecticut and denounced me as an enemy of the white race. But I offer that just as an example of how acceptable it is to do those things at an academic lecture today in a way that was just not the case, let's say 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And I do think there's plenty of evidence that some in our country do see this as a war. Andrew Anglin here from A Normie's Guide to the Alt-Right. And I don't, can you read it? Because I don't really want to read it to you. I think it's also probably not unreasonable to say that occasionally it's a war unto death. And I offer you here one of the sites of that war. And there's also evidence that some of the people involved in this war continue to draw inspiration from texts and ideas produced in the distant past, applying them in new ways to our world, to the society we live in order to make sense of their own world. And I offer you here Robert Bowers, who was the shooter at the Pittsburgh synagogue, his last social media post. So here's the question that worries me. Could the many people of goodwill in the world today, and I think most of us are people of goodwill, each trying in our own way to improve the world, not to worsen it, be caught in a similar moment as Hannah Arendt, who I think was also a person of goodwill and of extreme intelligence? Are we living through a moment in which anti-Judaism is increasingly widespread, becoming acceptable as a language of critique across many parts of the political spectrum, yet we're collectively unable or unwilling to detect and name the danger precisely because the anti-Semitism of today presents itself, as it so often has in the past, as a critique of realities of unjust power in the present. I offer you here a poster I found on campus. The furious controversy currently raging over the working definition of anti-Semitism, also called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, important though it is, seems from this point of view, to me anyway, depressingly familiar. I won't go into that controversy, except to say that once again, we seem to find ourselves as critical thinkers of goodwill, whether left, right, or center, trying to distinguish between reality and anti-Jewish prejudice, between legitimate criticism of Israel and of the Jews as privileged agents of power in a world of inequality on the one hand, and of unacceptable anti-Semitism on the other. And in the process, none of us seem to be able to recognize the growing power of anti-Judaism, meaning the power of thinking about Jews to explain the evils of our world and the ways that power makes us act. Or if we do recognize it, we see it only in the discourse of the other side. The left sees it in the right sees it in the left, never in our own. One way of putting the question, in the first half of the 20th century, the reality of economic inequality made it impossible and of stark differentials of power between capital and labor. Those are real differentials of power. They made it impossible to perceive the grotesque power of anti-Semitism at work in European society. Are there realities, and I pose it as a question, I don't have an answer. Historians are not really prophets. I wish, although I claim that we should be, we're not. Are the realities of inequality and stark differentials of power in our own society having a similar effect, making it impossible to see the growing power that anti-Judaism may be acquiring in our own time and place? I don't mean to depress you, so let me leave you with the positive side of my message. One thing that the history of anti-Semitism's past can offer us is an awareness that reality and anti-Jewish prejudice are not independent of each other, that it's easy to slip from one to the other without noticing, even when we think we are focused on our highest ideals, precisely because those ideals have often been built through a long history of thinking about the dangers of Judaism. And I include our religions as our greatest reservoirs of ideals. The slippage between reality and anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic ideas has proven very hard to detect for even the most subtle lover of knowledge. Developing an awareness of the terrifying work that slippage is achieved at various points in the past is, I still think, one of the best ways to cultivate a sensitivity to the danger today. And it's one of the gifts that the history of anti-Semitism can offer to the present and to the future. I welcome your questions.